And next up, we have Mr. Drew Ritzel. He is the acting director of the Criminal Justice Statistical Analysis Center, and this is at the Kentucky Justice and Public Safety Cabinet. The Criminal Justice and Statistical Analysis Center is relatively new. Just real quickly, as he's the acting director, prior to his work, he worked with the cabinet. He's worked with the Department for Veterans Affairs, the University of Kentucky College of Pharmacy, and the CDC Foundation. Drew has received his master or earned his Master of Public Health from the University of Kentucky. So we welcome Drew as he's going to talk to us about the Kentucky Domestic Violence Data Report.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ashley. Let me pull up my presentation. Just one moment. Okay, let's see. Okay, are we good? Are we seeing, I guess, the presentation itself?
We are seeing your your notes as well.
Okay, let's try to change this.
No worries. Take your time.
This is the struggle of working on multiple screens, and okay, let's see. Try this one more time. Okay, here we go. We should be seeing the correct thing now.
Looks great.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for having me today. So I want to introduce myself and give a little context for the Kentucky Domestic Violence Data Report. And so to introduce myself, okay. So my name is Andrew Ritzel. I go by Drew. Whatever you would like to call me, whatever you prefer. I am serving as the acting director for the Criminal Justice Statistical Analysis Center. So we are an entity within the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And so we work on a statewide level to bring information about criminal justice statistics. We help to manage programs. We help to build infrastructure. We wear many, many hats. And as Ashley mentioned, we are a relatively young entity within the Commonwealth. And it is a really exciting opportunity to improve our data quality and data availability related to many aspects of criminal justice. And so we are located within Frankfort, Kentucky. Here's a lovely picture of our building, kind of unassuming, but it is wonderful to be able to work in the cabinet. We work specifically in the office of the secretary. And so we were brought in on many different projects from anywhere from budget to legislation to special data mining projects to process improvement. We really wear many, many hats. So to give a little bit of history about CJSAC, so CJSAC is, like I said, is the Criminal Justice Statistical Analysis Center. We have existed in statute for a bit of time, and it's had a couple different iterations. So the idea and conception of a statistical analysis center dates back in Kentucky to 1984, originally within the Office of the Attorney General. And historically, we're able to find some reports from back then. They're a little bit few and far between. Nationally, there's been a big push for criminal justice statistical analysis centers as part of the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And these centers, really encourage to improve data quality in those individual states. We've existed in sort of different forms and functions over the years since 1984. It has not consistently existed. It has not consistently had reports. We've been in the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet, but a lot of times the responsibility for the Statistical Analysis Center existed as one individual as one part of their duties. And so we've been tied to the grants management division, we've been tied to the legislative director, to the budget division, in a lot of different ways. And so with Senate Bill 271, which I'll talk about here in a second, we essentially reestablished CJSAC on November 1st, 2022. And so we've been around for, nearly a year and a half now. In terms of, data organizations, it's relatively young still. So I always, encourage people to keep that in mind, when we're talking about this and talking about some of our efforts. It's an exciting opportunity because, being young, we're able to explore a lot of different opportunities and a lot of different options. But it also helps to contextualize what we are. So we are currently a 3-member team. That is an increase. Myself and the former executive director sort of served tandem and the sole entities of CJSAC for about a year. We've been able to add our budget manager and then our coordinator for the Saki grant, which is the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. We are managing that for the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet. The former executive director has since left. I'm now serving as the acting director. So we are a 3-person team. We're, really excited for the work that we are doing. In terms of responsibilities, like I said, we wear many, many hats. Our entity especially, I think we're all familiar with, job duties with, job descriptions with other duties as assigned. I think that is a very liberally used for, our entity, which is an exciting piece. But we do wear many hats, like I said. We are involved in federal grant management. We currently manage about $12 million worth of federal grant awards. We are tasked with improving the quality and usefulness of the criminal justice statistics throughout the Commonwealth. And we serve as a collaborating agent within the criminal justice system. And so the cool thing of our agency is that we are able to work with many different people within the criminal justice system. So that being, within Kentucky State Police, working with the Administrative Office of the Courts, we're working with corrections, we're working with attorneys, we're working with nonprofits. We're working really hard to understand the totality of the criminal justice system and make connections that didn't otherwise exist. A lot of the things that we found in our work is that, governments and nonprofits and individual agencies often exist in silos. And we never really looked at, how do we better, well, we have better looked at how we better collaborate, but, we've had the opportunity to improve upon systems, improve upon communications, to, better understand each of the agencies and better provide opportunities for collaboration. So it's been a very, neat opportunity. I think it's a very unique thing to be able to have that interagency and inter-department entity to be able to bridge those gaps. The former executive director and I often joke that, our job really is to bridge the gap and to really, have people communicating, have people data sharing, and working towards those goals. And so what part of the work that we do is the domestic violence data report. And so I wanted to give, I guess, a little bit of context for, what we know nationally, what we know as a state, and sort of give context that led into the creation of Senate Bill 271. So domestic violence and intimate partner violence are 2 terms that are used fairly interchangeably. I think if you put 10 people in a room, you'd have 20 different definitions for, what these terms look like. A lot of times we refer to statute to define, how Kentucky defines domestic violence. And so purposes of this presentation, well, I'll be using the phrase domestic violence primarily. Some of the topics we'll be touching on deal with interpersonal violence and interpartner violence, or intimate partner violence, excuse me. But for the purposes of the report, we're looking at sort of domestic violence specifically with some IPV components. So domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power or control over another. So this is looking at, violence in many different aspects. So physical, sexual, emotional, economical, psychological, technological actions. And this can also include threats as well. And so, even, threats of violence, things like that, cause emotional distress, and are often overlooked components of potential domestic violence. Um, the thing to be aware of with domestic violence, anyone can be a victim of domestic violence. So being men, women, child, elderly, anyone can be a victim of domestic violence. When we're looking at domestic violence, we're also considering, not only, intimate partners, but we're also looking at child abuse and we're also looking at elder abuse. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we document that within Kentucky, largely through some of our JC3 reporting. But that is a component when we're looking at domestic violence and for the DV report. The other thing to be aware of is that domestic violence is a gender-based violence, along with intimate partner violence is also gender-based. What that means is that according to statistics, women primarily tend to be the victims within domestic violence situations. They're the ones that are largely impacted. Men tend to be the perpetrators. And so that's something just to be aware of, when we're contextualizing this thing. Some statistics show, prevalence of domestic violence in IPV, and that there are similar rates of occurrence, but it doesn't necessarily show the full impact of what domestic violence and IPV. And so it's important to be aware of that context that women are disproportionately affected by these things. Because when we're contextualizing a lot of this, it is important to be aware of those power dynamics and some of those um, systemic inequalities that exist in this realm. In terms of existing data that we had, and so there have been many different forms of surveys, many different forms of data compilation within the state of Kentucky. The primary, prior to our report, the primary source of data was national surveys, and then also reporting on the services. And we have smaller, individual county-specific data or level data that had been released, Kentucky-specific policing data that had been released, but very few, if any, statewide reports that were existence. And so one data source I always like to refer to, that's a definitely very helpful source from the CDC, is the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. And so this is an excellent resource to give a lot of context for domestic violence to intimate partner violence. And so this is a survey that is conducted by the CDC. And so it is largely a phone-based survey. And so they interview individuals about their experiences related to DV and IPV. And it really gives great context because it also examines the health impacts of this type of violence. And so when we're looking at, domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and this is where the gender-based violence, information and context really comes into play. So their survey found that, when we're looking at, men and women experiencing context, sexual violence, physical violence, and stalking over their lifetime, roughly about 36.4% of women and 33.6% of men experience these things from an intimate partner throughout their lifetime. If we're looking at that statistic alone, it looks like it's very similar for men and women. And so while, anyone can be a, victim of domestic violence, it's not necessarily an accurate portrayal of what that experience is. And so the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey does an excellent job of better contextualizing that information. So the second statistic, I think, is the one that has a bigger impact and should be more widely used. So that is in the U.S., about 1 in 4, 25.1% of women, and 1 in 10 men, so 10.9%, experienced contact sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner, and reported an IPV-related impact during their lifetime. So this is, looking at continual effects from that experience. And so when we're looking at that statistic, it sort of shows the gender difference that exists within this realm, and that is very important to contextualize that because when we're thinking about how we're providing services, how we're defining how we're providing services, how we're designing policy, and really considering equity, we need to be aware of some of these statistics that are at play. So this leads to Senate Bill 271. So Senate Bill 271 was passed during the 2022 regular session. And so the impetus of this bill was to provide more data within the Commonwealth of Kentucky related to domestic violence, related to intimate partner violence, and to be able to produce a report that compiles this information and gives a little bit more context for this. And so per this bill, CJSAC is required to collect this information related to occurrences and fatalities related to domestic or dating and domestic violence. And so, this is part of our task. This was sort of the impetus to reestablish CJSAC, and, part of what our office duties are. And so it is a really wonderful thing to better provide data throughout the Commonwealth. And so when we're looking at reporting requirements, there are three main agencies that are providing information and contributing to this report. When we're looking at this report, CJSAC does not have ownership of this data, but our role is to compile this information and to help provide context, to help improve the data quality, and really look at things as a whole and sort of help support these agencies in providing this information. So Kentucky State Police has twofold reporting requirements. So they are required to report on the number of domestic violence calls for service, number of arrests made in response to domestic violence, and if an arrest was made, the arresting offense charged. And these are summaries of the reporting requirements. I encourage you to look at Senate Bill 271 for the full scope of it. This is also contained within the report itself, those reporting requirements. And then also within LINK, the Law Enforcement Network of Kentucky, that is a technology system maintained by KSP. So they are required to report on the number of orders of protection received, number of orders of protection served, just the general number of orders of protection within LINK, and then the average time for actual service to be returned. Administrative Office of the Courts is required to report the number and types of petitions for order of protections filed and denied, the number and types of petitions for interpersonal violence orders, number of emergency protective orders and temporary IPOs, and the number of DVOs and IPOs. And the Cabinet for Health and Family Services is required to report on the number of reports of alleged child abuse through an adult or child abuse hotline, shelter services for minors, shelter services for adults, as well as intervention and support services for minors and adults. And within that context of information, I also want to give a shout out to Zero V. So Zero V provides the cabinet with information about shelter services throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky. They were an integral partner in passing Senate Bill 271, and an integral partner when it came to developing this report as well. And so for the 2022 domestic violence data report, they were the main contributors of information for the CHFS section. And so in creating this report, like I said, this is the first and inaugural domestic or statewide Kentucky domestic violence data report. And so the goal of this report was to really create a baseline of information to help with policy and practice throughout the Commonwealth. This report is a fairly lengthy report, well over 200 pages. It is very dense. I think anyone that's looked at a report, understands that, it is quite a lot of information within it. Um, and our goal was to really, establish, like I said, that baseline, to have that first report, as a standard from which we're going to build upon and have a lot of conversations and really contextualize a lot of domestic violence situations throughout the Commonwealth. So in creating this report, CJSEC served as the primary compiler for the information. And so we had a regular working group that was working to discuss with our partners, to examine, what data exists, what data is inaccessible, what it means to report on this data, how we're reporting on this data. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges throughout that process, a little bit later. But anyone that I think has, taken a statistics course or has been involved with data in any capacity, knows that data is nuanced. And what that means is that, there are a lot of different ways to just report statistics. There are a lot of ways to compile information. And what a number says isn't always, an accurate representation of the actuality of things in existence. And so, when we're looking at domestic violence information in the Commonwealth, I think some people have the assumption that, we can just easily, access our computers and be able to pull out some numbers, and that it's a very straightforward thing. But it is a very nuanced process. As we're examining domestic violence and looking at some of these statistics, uh, we have to understand, what those numbers actually mean. How do we track domestic violence in the Commonwealth of Kentucky? Is the methods that we're using to, track and report this information, is that the best methodology? Are there, measurement standards that we're using that could be improved upon? Are there ways to improve the process? If we're using a certain measure, is that being accurately implemented throughout the Commonwealth? And so there are a lot of nuances for this information. Um, I think the strength of this report is that it is able to start a dialogue and start a lot of conversations, about how we report this information and how we can potentially improve upon it. Our goal in the Commonwealth, in the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet, is to always seek to improve. And so I think the creation of this report really started a lot of conversations that had never been had before, about how we track information, about how we allocate resources. And really, it is a potential for improving our data quality, improving our data tracking, and improving how we report this information. So a couple key figures that I'll pull out from the report, and I'll try to explain some of these, as we're going through. It is very dense, and a lot of information in the report. We decided to report the statistics as a statewide level statistics, but then also area development districts. And so we chose to do that in an effort, one, because this is the primary report, and be able to try to condense the information as much as possible to manageable doses of information. We considered reporting on county level statistics, which is something that we may still do in the future. But knowing that reporting on area development districts, there are 15 area development districts in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. If we're reporting on county level data, our 230-page report would easily turn into, a 700 and 800 report or page report. And so unable to try to condense some of that information, we chose to do by area development districts. I think the other consideration is that when we're looking at this information, reporting on this information, we also are aiming to not cause any potential harm to victims of domestic violence. In some smaller counties, there are smaller incidences of domestic, or smaller number of reported incidences of domestic violence. And so we, in doing this reporting, want to make sure that we protect those individuals and protect any potential for harm. And so with that in mind, that is why we chose to do area development districts. I'll be reporting on some of the statewide level data today and give a little bit of context for that. And so when we're looking at statewide level data, a lot of this information is working data. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the challenges and some of our next steps. But it's important to keep in mind that, this is not an academic survey. This is not, university-based, research and data collection. These are, procedural-based data collection or data information based on, the workings within Kentucky State Police, within the court system. And so with that, there are, potential areas of error, for certain areas of error that relate to, procedural error. And so that's something that we have an important consideration of, and hope to better explore and improve upon that within our working group and within, discussion or learning about this information. We've been able to already make some improvements to how we collect and report this data. And so that's just something to keep in mind with contextualizing some of this information. So when we're looking at cases of domestic violence, the primary mechanism that we use to track and report domestic violence throughout the Commonwealth is a form called the JC3. So the JC3 is a form that is used by the Kentucky State Police. And so this is used in any incidents that potentially involves domestic violence. And so that this form is used to collect information, track it, but it's also used to help support potential victims of domestic violence. And so, in the process of, collecting the JC3, there's also information given about support services throughout the Commonwealth. Should that individual choose to seek supportive services. Zero V and the Kentucky Association of Sexual Assault Prevention are integral partners in that, and helping to support potential victims when these incidents are occurring. So within the 2022 calendar year, we had 38,708 incidences of an electronic JC3 being filed. Within that, there are 8,867 incidences of arrests associated with the issuance of the JC3. An important context to know when we're looking at the JC3 and incidences, potential incidences of domestic violence. So like we talked about earlier, when we're looking at the Commonwealth's definition for domestic violence, this also includes elder abuse, this includes child abuse, as well as intimate partner. We are looking at incidences within a household. So some instances of like rape, for example, are not captured within the JC3 if it is, not by an intimate partner or certain circumstances. And these are, for Kentucky State Police, the way they're trained, they are trained to issue these JC3s if they suspect that it might be domestic violence. And so there are some cases where victims might not specifically report domestic violence. They may not, use that terminology, but we encourage Kentucky State Police to still file these if they suspect that this might be the case. The other thing to keep in mind with this information is that we know that from national surveys and knowing the context of DV and IPV, domestic violence and interpersonal or intimate partner violence tends to be underreported. We know that it takes multiple instances of domestic violence before the victim will necessarily reach out for help. And so, it's often, we know that while, over 38,000 instances of JC3 were filed, this number does not necessarily accurately reflect the number of instances of domestic violence within the Commonwealth itself. And so with this, some additional information that, is helpful to contextualize, the number of emergency protective orders and temporary interpersonal protector or partner protective orders entered into Link. We have nearly 20,000. And then the number of EPOs and TIPOs served is 16,402. So that's about 82%. The there needs to be further investigation to sort of the context for the discrepancy between the number of EPOs and TIPOs and the numbers served. The discrepancy, there are a lot of potential reasons for why there is a difference between those numbers. So when we're looking at that 18% that were not served, there are instances where that individual may have been arrested and maybe in the correction facilities. And so it might not necessarily be served because they're under arrest and under the custody of the state. We've had instances where that individual has died, instances where that person has fled, or instances where while the EPO or IPO has been entered, there have been either reversions per the request of the victim or sort of mitigating circumstances that may have caused that 18% discrepancy. And so that is something that is on our list for, further investigation. And, we want to be able to collect more information, more data and context for that. Typical time for service of those orders is about 3.8 days. The number of petitions filed, 27,524. So that's initial filing. Sometimes those petitions are withdrawn, dismissed. So about 20% of those petitions were, found to be denied. When we're looking at the Administrative Office of the Courts, so same numbers, very similar numbers within Administrative Office of the Courts and Link. And so when we're looking at long-term orders granted, there are 5,014 DVOs and 1,182 IPOs. The other important statistic that's helpful to know, and when we're talking about this gender-based violence that is existing, of the 27,521 respondents, an overwhelmingly large number of respondents to those orders were men, meaning that roughly 30% of the people receiving the IPOs are women, 70% are men, showing the overwhelmingly large number of perpetrators being men. And so that's, like I said, important when we're considering policy, when we're considering funding, and just sort of contextualizing this information. Additionally, when we have the section of services and the information of regards to that, so like I said, CHFS is the required reporting agency for that. Zero V did provide a lot of this contextualized knowledge, and as the ones being the service providers. And so we had 3,241 individuals served within the shelters. For shelter-specific services, nearly 13,000 individuals for non-shelter supportive services. And this shows really the strength of our nonprofit partners in really being able to support individuals that are experiencing DV and IPV throughout the Commonwealth. Total shelter nights, nearly 150,000 nights total across the 15 area development districts. And there still is a large unmet need for shelter. And so 1,278 requests that were not able to be met due to overcrowding due to severe demand or strong demands for supportive services throughout the Commonwealth. And there were additionally 21,421 calls made to crisis and hotline um, hotline crisis lines that are run by Zero B. So with this, some of the challenges and some of the nuances, the report goes into some of this, but I always like to, give a little bit of context for this information. Like I said, it is very dense. It is a lot of information in the report. Something that we hope to build upon, in the future is to simplify this information and make it a little bit more digestible, as well as be able to show trends over time as we continue to produce and publish these reports and collect this information. We talked about how DV and IPV is underreported, and sort of what this data means and if it accurately reflects, what is occurring throughout the Commonwealth. Um, this is, working data. And so, when we're comparing to surveys, there is survey methodology that reduces error and reduces bias. And this is not survey data. And so, this is working data. And so it shows, instances where these things occur, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a comprehensive look at domestic violence and interpersonal violence. And so I always like to talk about the survey resources because that, gives additional context, especially for those non-reported cases of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. One of the things that we are working towards that we do not currently have in the report is domestic violence related homicides. And so when the bill was originally outlined, it was a responsibility of the coroner's office to report on domestic violence related homicides. And through discussions within the cabinet, it was determined that that was not necessarily the appropriate mechanism for reporting on that information, given the limited contextual knowledge that their office has when they're reporting on deaths and cause of death. Domestic violence is, a much more nuanced and contextualized situation. And so the coroner's office may not necessarily be able to tell that. It might not have necessarily the full picture to be able to accurately provide that information. And so that is a goal that we are working towards as an office to determine how to best report that information. And so while we unfortunately were not able to produce in this initial report, that is something we're actively working towards. The other thing to be aware of, when we're looking at this is talking about data systems. And I won't go too much into depth with this because that could be another, hour-long presentation in itself. But we have found that, a lot of the data systems that are being used to track these metrics may not be the most up-to-date. A lot of these systems are, homegrown or department-based systems and have not traditionally talked to one another. And so we have not been able to accurately, well, not necessarily, not accurately, but we have not been able to track the full scope and picture and journey of an individual that is experiencing domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And so our goal through CJSAC, we've been working very hard to update systems and build APIs so that we are able to get a more comprehensive picture of the full lifetime and scope of from reporting to sentencing, what that looks like for both victims and perpetrators, and get a better scope of that. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing with a lot of these federal grant programs are about building stronger data systems to be able to support this. Because we're going to need strong data systems and able to really improve our data tracking quality. When we're looking at next steps, we have a lot of goals, a lot to move forward. Like I said, this report is a baseline. And so Personally, I hope that this is, the broadest and most uh, roughest, I guess, report that we produce. I hope that every report we produce henceforward will, give better information and improve upon how we report this information. So as part of Senate Bill 271, Zero V produces a best practice and policy recommendation report in the fall. And so this is both reporting about recommendations for how we can improve this data quality, how we can improve data reporting, but also about policy and practice and sort of contextualizing this information. The report that was produced this past year focused primarily on this initial report and about how we can better track and improve upon this data. It's an excellent report. I definitely encourage you to check it out. It is fairly comprehensive and includes both short-term and long-term goals that we're actively working towards. We aim to always improve data quality. We aim to improve criminal justice system improvements. And so with that, we're making improvements to the JC3 and how we implement the JC3, about how we track data within that information and how we report on that information, as well as training. And so we're doing that across the criminal justice system in a lot of different approaches. And so it is exciting because this report really is an impetus for many additional projects that are stemming from this initial data compilation. Additionally, we're doing additional domestic violence data projects. And so I personally hope to grow our CJSAC office because, like I said, we are a team of 3 right now. And it will be necessary for us to have a larger team in order to really improve upon this data quality and collection and really have the dedicated resources for this. We're also working with a lot of different partners, both in the Commonwealth and nationally, to bring more domestic violence data. And so we are very fortunate to be able to work with those through different grant programs and different funding mechanisms to provide, additional data quality or different data metrics to be able to improve upon this reporting and give a better comprehensive view of what, this information is. And that is the summary of it. The main takeaways from this are that, this is very exciting that we are doing this data collection process. I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to, build upon this information. And I think it's exciting because we're able to give context for, why, DV and IPV related initiatives really deserve proper funding and uh, deserve, proper reporting in terms of legislation and, different comprehensive structuring for supporting these initiatives. So with that, I will thank you and hand it back over to Ashley.
Thank you, Drew. If you have questions for Drew, we can take one question. If not, we can hold it until the end of the presentation. Drew, quickly, I had a question and I placed it in the chat. You quickly ran over the reasons to why a petition would be denied. Some of those were saying they didn't exist. Are there a list of other reasons that a petition would be denied?
Um, so some of that information is contained within the report itself. Some of that information is a potential area for additional research and data gathering. And so part of our goal within the cabinet is to get a better idea of, how these protective orders are granted, potential areas for why it's being denied, and to get a better context for this information. And so that we know that some of this is not uniformly enforced and granted across the Commonwealth. So there are some areas where it is, a higher number of IPOs and DVOs are granted. And so part of that is about resourcing, part of it is about how certain courts grant this information. Um, and so that is a long way of saying that is an area that we hope to expand upon within future reports, and probably more than likely supplemental reports are needed for this as well.
Thank you. I know before the webinar, I scrolled through the report and there is a lot to digest. So, and it is not light reading. So just
No,
make
no,
sure you have the right resources available to support yourself, um, and walk away, get some fresh air. There's a lot going on in our state. And it's great that this report helps draw attention, increase awarenesses so we can get those prevention and intervention services there. Thank you, Drew. We appreciate your presentation.